I think the issue, and something I did pose to her, is that this Council of Ministers want to increase the population. It's not simply a matter of people will always come and go. It's the fact that they deliberately want to grow the population to pay for the ageing population. Now there are other models. They don't have to do that. They could have a progressive tax system, but they've decided they want effectively a pyramid scheme to increase the population. That's going to put more pressure on resources. They don't want to build in the green zones, and they're quite restricted about how they can build in town. So I suspect we're going to see high-rise development in St Helier, which is not necessarily a problem so long as it's done well.
You did raise the question, the great unmentionable, the missing 10,500, the non-qualified. You did mention those. You did raise the question. There's clearly no plan, no intention to house them, is there?
I think that's an issue. I mean, we're actually going to be conducting a scrutiny review which will look at exactly the supply and demand issues, and you can't look at that very complex model without taking into account the 10,000 people that you say don't have.
They've been here ever since 1970. There were 10,000 in 1970. There are 10,500 official stats figures, state stats department.
It is an emotive issue because, of course, we're a small island, and the government have used this ostensibly to control the population, along with the 5-year or the 10-year rule. Now, the issue with that is it's at best a blunt tool, and the consequence of it is it keeps supply there, and it means that some landlords who can rent out property to a fairly, how should we say,
well, the worst end of housing. These people are occupying the worst end of housing, so those controls which you want for better standards, deposit protection, they're the ones who are in most need of all this protection.
Yeah, absolutely. But you can find examples right across the board. I mean, the ironic thing is that lodging houses do have some level of standards.
They're available for everybody to rent.
They may not be particularly spacious, but they meet theoretically a minimum standard, whereas other unqualified accommodation doesn't, private accommodation doesn't. And ironically, we could see a situation where social housing is of a better standard across the board than private sector, and it means that you can actually complain much more easily.
Well, there was rather vague about how Andium can be required, because they've got their own decent standards, and how that relates to rent. Again, you raise that question. If it's not a decent standard, why should people pay the full rent? You raise that question, but that's more so in the private sector, isn't it? What can you do if you're a private landlord? The accommodation you've got is rotten. You're obliged to live there. You can't find anywhere else. You live there, but what do you do about it?
And that's why the residential tenancy law is completely unsatisfactory. It will need to be replaced in quick order, because the test that's used in that law is of uninhabitable. Uninhabitable can be quite a high bar, really, but you can certainly, it's for the court to decide that. Tenants and landlords will be reluctant to test out that law, understandably, and that's why we need to have much clearer guidelines and statutory.
I still get the feeling we're still trying to protect landlords rather than the tenants. I mean, certainly this minister, I don't think, is certainly going to be very resolute in doing anything to upset landlords.
What I think is that I think we've come a long way. I think there's an understanding now that we need good quality housing. The conversations I've had with civil servants, and I do have confidence in the officers, for example, they're youngish guys. They've probably had to live here in unqualified accommodation themselves, possibly, and they're aware that it needs to be addressed. So I've got some confidence, but again, it's always about keeping the ministers to account and making sure that they're taking effective steps.
You raised numbers of empty dwellings. Now, they've been talking about empty dwellings for as long as I can remember. The figure of 3,000 empty dwellings was mentioned for all sorts of reasons, but obviously a lot of those units should not be empty. What's going to be done about that?
Well, we need more information. That was a snapshot from the social survey. And there'll be all sorts of reasons that those buildings are empty. It could be between tenants, there could be some restoration that needs to be done. The question is, how long are they staying empty for? And why are they staying empty? And could we amend the rate system? If something's been empty for a year and we know it's been empty for a full year, there is a way to increase the rate on that if we wanted to do it. We could introduce that to if you like, incentivise.
Or start possessing a few properties.
Yeah, and I think the other issue is everybody in Jersey lives somewhere, presumably. So if they're driving affordable housing, if they want more home ownership, which this government will do ideologically, then clearly there needs to be a redistribution of property. If you've got one landlord who owns 1,000 properties, that's 999 properties that could be owned by someone else, and we need to look at perhaps ways of redistribution and that are acceptable in the Jersey context.
There were many other questions asked yesterday. I can't raise any more today. Have you got anything else you want to say finally?
I think that I'm going to carry on pressing in this term. My main aim is to get the introduction of good quality housing standards, which are actually going to be regulated in a meaningful way, so that landlords and tenants can have peace of mind when it comes to the very basic necessity of accommodation.
Everybody needs somewhere decent to live. Thanks, Bronte.